Good morning, everyone. My name is Sandy Dixon. We will be getting started here for our CVS breakout session. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Great. So we are glad we're able to join you. We wish we were in person, but we do hope that we have saved you perhaps some travel time and travel expenses. Again, my name is Sandy Dixon. I'm the lead CVS planner here at GCC. I just wanted to give you a quick reminder of who your Crime Victim Services planning team is. It does include myself. We have Dawn Brown. She is our newest planner. She's been with us since September 8th. So she is certainly very new, and we welcome her. We have Jim Lassiter and Adonica McAllister. They are our VOCA planners. And we have Karen Lombury, who is our VAWA planner. And I'm very fortunate to work with these amazing folks. And I think you will be pleased as well as you get to work with them on your applications. Today, we're going to cover several important areas for you to learn about as you begin to draft your thoughts and ideas for the application. And just as a reminder, the application cycle opens November 1st. Some of the areas we'll cover today, we want to give you a very brief overview of the federal funds that are awarded to the CVS committee. Then we will go into the details about the funding priorities for 2021. And lastly, we will cover some critical reminders about components of the application that are very specific to the Crime Victim Services applications. First, let's begin. As Caroline talked about in our opening, the Governor's Crime Commission is composed of 3 committees: the Criminal Justice Improvement Committee, the Juvenile Justice Committee, and of course the Crime Victim Services Committee, which we also lovingly refer to as the CVS Committee. First, our mission is to advocate for victims by promoting the development of effective programs that improve the response of human service professionals and the criminal justice system to crime victims. One of the things we felt it was important to make you all aware of is how are each year the CVS funding priorities developed. And just very broadly speaking, we first start with staff input. This is where we gather information about what would the amounts be for our federal award. This helps us plan and provide you information as you draft your applications. We're also going back and we're looking at what were the prior priorities for the CVS committee, what other types of applications we've gotten in the past and the amounts of those applications. We're also looking at historical information for those projects and the agencies that are running them. And as planners, we are well-versed and up to date on various innovative ideas, research from the field. Caroline mentioned our Criminal Justice Analysis Center, as well as we're in touch with our colleagues across the country. In addition, we have a CVS advisory group. These are the boots on the ground, a good broad representation of service providers from across the state, and they provide input. They also let us know what are the new and innovative things that are happening in the field here in North Carolina. And we have, for example, heard about some wonderful techniques and service changes that you all have been making as it relates to COVID. Then this information, the staff input and the information from the advisory group, is provided to the CVS committee. They review all of this information and they will make the final recommendations to the Governor's Crime Commission. As Caroline mentioned in the opening, a very important factor for looking at applications for 2021 was the amount of the federal funds that we have estimated will be available. We're going to go over that in a little more detail. Sometimes when we hear that the monies have been reduced, we don't have a real visual on that, and I'm going to provide you a visual in a moment. But overall, VAWA STOP funds, we estimate those funds will be similar to 2020. And for VOCA, we also estimate that this will be similar to 2020, but we do need to make you aware that there has been an approximately 48% reduction between 2018 and 2020. So let's look at what that looks like visually. As you can see, in the last decade, the VAWA STOP funds have been very consistent. So this makes it much easier to plan and to fund projects on a continuing basis. For VOCA, we don't quite have that same balance, that same consistency. And I think this is a stark reminder of what Caroline had said, that we need for you to really consider in your applications what is necessary. The larger the grants, the fewer the number of grants we can fund. So as you look at your projects that perhaps have been funded in past years, you may have to look at what is necessary, what is the core service, and remove some items that you may have had in your budget in the past. So when we think of things that you may be able to reduce, perhaps we can look at travel. Are you doing as much traveling? Are there different ways for you to get training that may not be as expensive, such as webinars or virtual trainings? Is it possible to send staff, fewer number of staff, to trainings and ask them to come back and provide in-services to your staff and your volunteers? Just some things to think about. So I can't emphasize this enough. That's why it's in all caps, it's underlined, it's in red, and we have an exclamation point. There have been reductions to projects over the last several years, and this has impacted both our non-competitive, or what we lovingly refer to as basic. These are for the sexual assault, domestic violence, and child advocacy centers. And this year also the automated victim notification services priority, as well as our competitive. And both Adonica and Karen will get into more details about these restrictions we put in place to try to manage the reductions. And with that, I will turn the presentation over to Adonica McAllister to talk about our VOCA funding priorities for 2021.
Thank you, Sandy. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to be talking to you about our VOCA funding priorities. If we could go to the next slide, Sandy. So VOCA, or the Victims of Crime Act of 1984, includes services under the grant program that are intended to respond to the emotional and physical needs of crime victims, assist primary and secondary victims of crime to stabilize their lives after victimization, assist victims to understand and participate in the criminal justice system, and to provide victims of crime with a measure of safety and security as appropriate to their victimization. Next slide. So the Governor's Crime Commission has mandatory allocations that we must make to our federal award for the federal government. This is partially how we establish our funding priorities. So our minimum allocations and our obligation to the program include of our services and funds devoted to sexual assault, 10% to domestic, or as stated in VOCA, spousal abuse. And we have some definitions there as well. It does encompass domestic and intimate partner violence, though the statute says spousal abuse because 1984. 10% must go to child abuse, and victims of child abuse include child victims of physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. Now, under VOCA, we can serve adults who were victimized as children. However, they would be served under a different priority. And then finally, we have an obligation to devote 10% of our funding efforts to previously underserved communities. And the crime victims in this, allocation category can include culturally specific or underserved communities, as well as the type of crime. So, for example, if elder abuse is something that is not well served in your community, then you may be eligible to apply for an underserved grant project based on that. Next slide, please. So the requirements of VOCA include that agencies must have a record of demonstrating effective services and have a history of providing direct services. So VOCA doesn't fund startups. The agencies must provide documentation of substantial financial support from other sources outside of the Crime Victims Fund. Now, new victim services organizations, and that means new organizations, not newly funded organizations by us, must show financial capacity with at least 25% of their funding coming from other sources. It may include other federal funds, state funding, and other non-federal funding support. Next slide. Okay. So our application limitations for the upcoming application window. Agencies can submit no more than 3 applications. Now, this is for competitive. So, for example, if your organization is applying for a basic services project, you can still apply for that basic services project, but no more than 3 competitive applications. Growth is going to be limited. As we've continued to emphasize in our workshops, we don't know what our federal award amount will be. However, we do know that the available funds are decreasing, and they have had a trend in going the direction that we don't want them to go. Awards under the VOCA program, funded through the Governor's Crime Commission, will be made for up to 2 years. Next. Okay. So we do have priorities that are formula funded, and those include our sexual assault and domestic violence victim services, our child advocacy centers across the state, and then our automated victim notification priority. If you do not receive a notification from the Governor's Crime Commission that this is the amount that you should be applying for under your basic CAC grant project, you are not eligible to apply under that. However, if you feel like this is something that may have been an oversight, feel free to contact the Governor's Crime Commission and the Crime Victim Services team. That way we can figure out whether or not, you are to receive a basic services allocation. So, Sandy, if you could go back, thank you. So our first VOCA funding priority is for our sexual assault and domestic violence victim services. And those proposals should include the basic needs for victims of sexual assault and domestic violence. Again, this is for our basic services organizations across the state. And the proposal should include a plan of action to provide those core services to victims of crime. So some examples of the types of programs that may be funded under this include client outreach services, crisis line operations, mental health services that are core to your program and essential, counseling and support, information and referral services, language line services, legal assistance, relocation expenses, shelter and transitional housing services, and hospital accompaniment, for example. Our second funding priority, or funding priority B, is for our child advocacy centers. And again, these are for approved providers only. So they have to be fully or provisionally accredited by CAC-NC. Each organization also has to upload a letter basically verifying their status of accreditation. Proposals for the child advocacy centers, again, include those basic services. So it would be advocacy, evidence-based mental health services, CMEs or child medical evaluations, forensic interviews, and forensic medical evidence collection exams. So the following priorities are competitive, and that means that they are voted on by members of the Governor's Crime Commission. Those priorities include underserved crime victim services, legal services for victims of crime, collaborative or multi-agency models, also known as family justice centers, victims of human trafficking, child abuse victim services, and there is a priority called other services for victims of crime. In our underserved category, again, the populations can be distinguished by the type of crime or by certain demographic characterizations. So again, that would include your culturally specific, programs, but it may also include programs that might address identity theft, for example. The populations included in underserved crime victim services require special considerations primarily because they have been historically underserved. And under the priority, these programs should look to develop and continue implementing programs that address those gaps in services for that underserved crime or those underserved crime victims. So some examples of underserved populations may include, but they're not limited to, culturally specific populations, rural populations, elderly victims of crime, disabled victims of crime, veterans or military personnel, adult survivors of child abuse, victims of gang-related crimes, and survivors of homicide victims. Priority D is legal services for victims of crime. And this is where we see a lot of our providers like legal aid and other local service providers continuing to provide basic legal service crime. So statewide legal agencies and organizations can apply, and also local and regional nonprofits that provide legal services to victims of crime. Legal services that are necessary or that can be funded under this priority basically have to be necessary as a result of the victimization. So this includes our protective orders, potentially immigration filings based on the victimization, for example, trafficking visas, et cetera. It's important to note that criminal defense and civil tort actions are not allowable with VOCA funding. Priority E, collaborative or multi-agency models, also known as family justice centers. Funding awarded under this priority will assist local communities in providing services through co-located service models. So essentially what we're looking for, again, we changed the phrasing of this last year, but this would include our family justice centers. And those proposals should promote the collaborative effort of service providers in making services more readily available to victims and their one-stop shop. However, it is important to note that co-location of all service providers is not a requirement. So for example, some programs may have part-time providers that come in a couple times a week and share the facility that way. However, your program is designed is up to you, and it will be up to review by our commission. Next slide. So centers should establish a collaborative plan specifying how victims will access services and obtain referrals for support and assistance. They should also have memoranda of understanding with the local partners outlining how the groups will provide those core crisis intervention services, and it must be uploaded to the application. This is important because we really want to see how the design of your program works and how you'll be working together in order to better serve victims of crime. Services under this priority may include coordinated intake and navigation of referrals, counseling services, shelter services, legal assistance services, forensic medical examinations, emergency services, and information and referral services. Priority F is for victims of human trafficking. Proposals under this priority are accepted from agencies that will be addressing human trafficking, and that includes child victims of trafficking as well as victims of labor trafficking. It also must include, your application has to include as an attachment, a letter of support from the North Carolina Human Trafficking Commission and other service providers. This is because we want to know that you're connected with our statewide agencies and that everyone's on the same accord as we look to address issues related to human trafficking. All human trafficking proposals must include efforts, again, to develop and or improve a multi-system, interagency, multidisciplinary response to human trafficking victims. And so, again, we really stress taking a collaborative approach, especially as across the state, we're all looking at the bigger picture and addressing these crimes and providing services to victims of crime together. And again, collaborative partners can include local agencies, but must include the North Carolina Human Trafficking Commission. Some services that can be provided may include case management, client outreach services, evidence-based mental health services, counseling and support services, court advocacy, information and referral services, legal services, shelter and transitional housing, and also language translation services. Funding priority G is child abuse victim services. This is different from our child advocacy center's priority. This is aside from that because this can serve as an enhancement to those CAC projects, as well as it can serve as a priority for agencies who may not be accredited to provide any additional support services to child victims that may come into their office. So victims of child abuse, again, may include victims of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, child pornography related offenses, neglect, sexual exploitation, bullying, and or exposure to violence. Developing CACs should apply for funding under this category. So if there's no accreditation, please apply under this priority while you're on the way to receiving your accreditation. Accredited CACs interested in providing additional or enhanced services may also apply for a project as an enhancement to their basic grant under this priority. Next slide. Priority H, other services for victims of crime include services that are allowable through VOCA funding that will serve as enhancements to your basic services programs. However, it's important to note that if you're going to be applying under other services for victims of crime, it cannot be identical to your basic services project. It should serve as an enhancement, include additional services or personnel, etc. It cannot duplicate your other grant. All of these proposals should include a plan of action and a statement of collaboration to provide enhanced services to victims of crime. Next slide. So some examples may include transitional housing services, relocation services, emergency medical assistance, sexual assault nurse examiner services, client outreach services, evidence-based mental health services, services for victims of financial fraud or identity theft, and services for victims addressing the intersection of violence and substance use disorder. Finally, and this is kind of a change from previous years, but automated victim notification services. This is now going to be a basic services priority or a designated agency only because one agency is the only one that typically receives funding for this. So proposals will be considered for automated victim notification services and technology services. And that includes text notifications, email, other electronic notification services. And this may include staff who provide services to alert victims on status changes of offenders in jail, correctional, or court systems. Other electronic and text notifications with multiple language capability and operator assistance is also encouraged. And so let's talk about some unallowable activities. And primarily, these are the same between VOCA and VAWA, but I'm speaking only to VOCA, and Karen will go over the ones for VAWA. So lobbying and advocacy is unallowable. Research and studies are unallowable. Active investigation and prosecution of criminal activities, except for the provision of victim assistance services to victims of crime. So what does this mean? Law enforcement agencies, court agencies, etc., may apply for VOCA funding, but it cannot be used for the purposes of investigating or prosecuting any crimes. Instead, they can apply for VOCA funding for an advocate, for example, in their legal offices or in the police station. Fundraising activities are unallowable, as well as capital expenses, which include capital improvements, property losses and expenses, real estate purchases, mortgage payments, and construction. Next slide. Reimbursement of crime victim to crime victims for expenses incurred because of a crime, except as otherwise allowed. And this is because VOCA also funds victim compensation. And so we can't double dip. We have to make sure that what we are providing to victims of crime, again, is allowable within the capabilities of what we are able to do. Victim compensation is an option. The Governor's Crime Commission does not oversee victims' compensation, but we do work closely with them. Medical care, except as otherwise allowed. Salaries and expenses of management, board members, and other administrators, except as specifically allowed. And also trinkets such as hats, mugs, portfolios, t-shirts. I know we get a lot of requests for pins, etc. Those items are not allowable items. And now I will pass it over to Karen Lombry, who will be talking about the STOP funding priorities. Karen?
Hi, everybody. So my name is Karen Lombry, and I'm the VAWA planner here at GCC. I'm here today to talk to you about the STOP funding priorities. And I also want to note, I see a lot of folks putting some questions in the chat. We are answering them, the ones that we can as they come in. But we are also going to have some opportunity as we have extra time to be able to answer some questions at the end. So if we don't get to your question in the chat, we will definitely get to your question at the end. Okay. So back to VAWA. So the VAWA STOP funding is, this is through the Violence Against Women Act. This act was passed in 1994 by Congress and created the Office of Violence Against Women in the United States Department of Justice. So STOP stands for Services, Training, Officers, and Prosecutors. So the Violence Against Women's Formula Grants created the STOP program, and it promotes a coordinated multidisciplinary approach to improving the criminal justice system's response to violent crimes against women. STOP encourages the development and strengthening of effective law enforcement and prosecution strategies to address violent crimes against women, and the development and strengthening of victim services in cases involving crimes against women. Okay, so this is a little small for you to see, but you are going to get the slides. By statute, GCC is federally mandated to allocate STOP funding in the following manner. So 30% of the funding has to go to victim services. 25% of the funding goes to law enforcement. Another 25% goes to prosecution. 5% goes to state and local courts. And 15% goes to what's called discretionary. And we have determined that discretionary, what projects can apply under discretionary are prevention programs and batterers intervention programs. And what you'll see the category there, so we have the priority, then we have the projected 2021 funding, and that's if we receive flat funding for next year. So when we start this whole process of doing the award workshops, we don't know how much funding we're going to be getting. So that's anticipating that we have flat funding, meaning the same exact amount of funding that we got last year. Additionally, we have focus areas that we have to specifically set some money aside for. So 30% of the victims services allocation. So of the 30%, I'm sorry, victim services allocation, at least 10% has to be set aside for culturally specific and culturally competent services. Okay. And then at least 20% of the total award, okay, must be set aside for projects that meaningfully address sexual assault and sexual violence, but those are only out of the victim services, law enforcement, prosecution, and state and local courts. We're going to go into that a little bit more in depth as we go further into the presentation. Next slide. Okay, so for this, the Office of Violence Against Women sets funding priorities, and currently they are to reduce violent crimes against women and promote victim safety through investing in law enforcement, increasing prosecution, and promoting effective prevention, empowering victims to become survivors by growing them past their vulnerabilities and to a place of self-sufficiency, increasing efforts to combat stalking, and to address the specific challenges that rural communities face in responding to the stop crime area. Next slide. Okay, so when you are going to be completing your application, you're going to need to identify in your application at least one priority service for your proposed project. So you're going to either choose victim services, law enforcement, prosecutors, state and local courts, or discretionary. So the thing is, the priority service area that you're going to pick should be who's going to be benefiting from this project. So if you are a victim services provider who is going to provide training to law enforcement, then you would say law enforcement is going to benefit from this training, so you would apply under law enforcement, if that makes sense. But the one caveat is for the courts, the funding must go to the courts. So I cannot train a victim services, we cannot fund a victim services provider to provide training for the courts. The courts would need to get that money and then, develop a partnership with you for you to provide that training. And also one thing to note is that the violence areas that stop focuses on is domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. So human trafficking victims who have been sexually assaulted or battered by an intimate partner can be served with stop funds. So we were talking about discretionary. So the two, like we said, the two types of projects that can be funded through discretionary are court-sanctioned batters intervention programs. For these batters intervention programs, you have to be certified by the Council for Women and Youth Involvement, and you will have to be able to provide your certification from the Council for Youth Involvement, for Women and Youth Involvement, if you are going to apply for this funding. So our second type of funding that we're going to fund through discretionary are primary and secondary prevention programs. One thing to note is that no more than 5% of the state's total stop award may be used for those purposes. So what you saw in the chart earlier, that the amount of money that it's not mandatory that we fund prevention, but if we are going to fund prevention, that we can only use up to that 5%. Next slide. Then when you complete your application, you're going to be prompted to choose in certain areas. We talked about the culturally specific or sexual assault. It's not mandatory that you choose one of these areas. If you're a culturally specific or organization, and your project is going to be a culturally specific project, you would choose yes. If your project solely focuses on sexual assault, then you would choose yes for that question as well. And again, it's not mandatory for you to select one of those, but it's going to help us to understand which allocation categories you should go in. Next one. And so for the sexual assault, projects that are assigned to the victim services, law enforcement, prosecution, and our courts priorities are eligible to choose this focus area. And again, it has to be solely focused. So if you have, let's say, a prosecutor who works on domestic violence and sexual assault cases, that would not fall under the sexual assault focus area, because the project has to solely focus on sexual assault. And they also have to have a sole and legitimate focus on that. So we really just want to make sure that not only is it a sole and legitimate focus, but also that the personnel funded on the project have sufficient expertise and experience with sexual assault. So you're meaningfully addressing sexual assault with people that have the understanding of what working with individuals with sexual assault, who experience sexual assault means. Next slide. Okay, so now for the culturally specific, in order to be able to apply for the culturally specific, under the culturally specific focus area, only organizations that are applying under the victim services priority are eligible to choose this focus area. And if you are an organization that wants to choose this focus area, in order to be eligible, you have to be focused on working with racial and ethnic minorities, which include American Indians, Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and other Pacific Islanders, Blacks, and Hispanics. Next slide. Additionally, the organization must be a nonprofit, non-governmental organization or tribal organization that serves a specific geographic community, but also that has a focus or has programs that focus primarily on domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking, has established a specialized culturally specific program that addresses those areas, has a primary focus on the underserved populations, obtains expertise or shows demonstrated capacity to work effectively on those crime areas, and is primarily directed toward racial and ethnic minority groups, and is providing services tailored to the unique needs of that population. So if you are a general domestic violence services provider and you say you want to have a project that reaches out to specifically to Asian Pacific Islanders who are and the staff will be all made up of individuals who are Asian Pacific Islanders, and then you have some folks consulting with you to be able to provide a culturally specific program, you will not qualify under this because your organization isn't focused on Asian Pacific Islanders. Next slide. So then STOP has, or through OVW, STOP has issued, I believe it's 24 purpose areas. And through meeting, and the purpose areas it kind of defines what types of projects and programs that STOP will fund. What we've done over the years is in terms of the Governor's Crime Commission, with input from our advisory groups and committees, we have narrowed down those purpose areas into 13 purpose areas that align with the state of North Carolina's implementation plan and fill in funding and service gaps for the state. So when you go into your application, you're going to need to select which purpose area most specifically aligns with the work that you're looking to do. So if you have any questions, you can definitely feel free to reach out to me to help you to find which ones align the best, but also just so that you know, you can choose more than one. Next slide. Okay, so this is like a screenshot from GEMS. And when you get in there, depending on, again, which priority service area that you pick, you're going to be asked to select a focus area. So is it for sexual assault? And then you'll see the radial button that says yes or no, or that you click. Is this going to focus on culturally specific? You pick yes or no. And then below that, there'll be the purpose areas. And so then you'll go through the 13. And like you said, you could click more than one, but you pick which purpose area. So that's what it'll look like in GEM. Okay, so now I want to talk to you about STOP application limitations and funding caps. Okay, so these are different than VOCA. So remember, Adonica was talking to you about VOCA specifically, so I'm talking to you about STOP specifically. Agencies may submit one application under each GCC funding priority service area for the STOP program. So prosecutorial districts that fall under the AOC, each district is considered a single subrecipient. So, if you're in District 3 can apply, District 4 can apply, etc. You have to realize that additional applications, if an organization submits 2. So if an organization submits 2 in the victim services area, we're going to go through, and what's going to happen is, we talked about earlier that preliminary review process. I'm going to see that your organization has applied for 2, and I'm going to reach out to you, and I'm going to say, listen, I need you to choose which application you want to move forward with. Also, you have to be mindful of, do not submit if an application you submit under, if we look through and you applied under an incorrect priority and we move that application to the correct priority it should fall under, and now you have 2 within the same priority, we're going to have that same conversation. So just be very mindful when you're applying about that one application for priority. And if you have any questions about the priorities, please let me know. Definitely feel free to reach out to me. And now talking about growth, back up a bit. In talking about growth, as we talked about earlier, as funding is limited, agencies requesting funding for continuation projects. So if you have, again, I'm picking on the prosecutors today, but if you have a prosecutorial grant for District 4, and now you're looking to get funding again for that to do the same work, we're asking people that you must have level funding. So you're not going to be able to increase your funding from last year. So the federal share of the project cannot increase. But for organizations that are coming in that are applying for the first time, we wanted to set some guidelines and parameters that we didn't have in the RFA last year, but we followed during the award process and the funding process and the decision-making process. So what we did was for victim services providers, you can apply for a new project and you can apply for up to $200,000 for individuals applying under the victim services priority. For individuals applying under the law enforcement priority, you can request up to $140,000. Same for prosecution. And then discretionary, Batter's intervention programs can apply for up to $55,000 for projects that cover an individual region. If a project is going to cover, because Batter's intervention programs are not consistent throughout the state, there are some projects that cover multiple regions. They will be able to apply for up to $100,000 if you're going to cover a multiple service area region. What's going to happen there is that you will need to get a letter from the Council for Women supporting your application for the increased funding of the $100,000. In terms of prevention programs, you can request up to $55,000 for your in this upcoming year. Next slide. Okay, so now we're going to come up to the application components and attachments section, and I'm going to turn this back over to our CVS lead planner, Sandy Dixon.
Okay, thank you, Karen and Adonica. We appreciate that. We've seen lots of questions come up in the chat box. So we're going to go through this fairly quickly. This is reiterating some of the primary areas that you need to focus on in the application. Hang on one second. There we go. Spend the time on project abstract. Also, the abstract and all of the other narratives, the narrative summary, how you're going to collaborate, your timeline of activities, describing that sustainability plan that we focused on. In addition, you're going to want to put within these narrative sections, there's a narrative section for personnel and contractual, as well as supplies and operating. Tell us how this ties into the services, the items you want and put in your budget tie into the services. Also, this year, we have always asked for a detailed project budget narrative as a separate attachment. But this year we wanted to emphasize that we have a new template and you must use this form. Finally, attachments. They must be numbered correctly. We have been fairly generous over the years with the attachments, but due to such restrictions in funding or reductions in funding and how much the competitiveness has increased, we are looking at the attachments. And if you have more attachments, you're going to score higher. You're going to make it through the process a lot easier. Without those, we may not consider your application for funding. So let's talk about those required attachments. First, we're going to review what is required of all applicants. Any required forms will be available on the GCC website. So we want to make note of that. Like I said just a second ago, the detailed budget narrative it has a section for you to describe perhaps a little more detail why this budget item is needed. And that is a new required form that's available. You have to provide a summary of your direct and contracted funds. And we want to make sure that that includes current and projected funding. We also need a list of your staff allocations for the staff and the volunteers that are budgeted to the project. If you have an equipment lease or rental space agreement, we will need a floor plan and need a copy of that as well. Indirect cost documentation. Diane went through this, as well as Jim and Navin. Please upload that federally negotiated indirect cost rate or your de minimis indirect cost certification. Detailed supply list. A Word document is fine for this. We need that detail, Post-it notes, paper clips, etc. Also, those written agreements that we've highlighted here, please add those as attachments. We also require of all applicants certain policies, and you'll note in parentheses, for example, the travel policy, we need to see those reimbursement rates, but only if you are requesting travel or mileage as a cost in this project. Procurement and purchasing policy, if you're purchasing anything in the project, then we need to have that policy. All applicants must submit a whistleblower policy, as well as a data breach and imminent breach policy, and we do have a sample on our website. We also need to see a conflict of interest policy and an overtime policy, but only if overtime is budgeted within your project. So now let's talk about some required attachments that apply only to certain applicants. All nonprofits, we must have a copy of your 501c3 certification, your most recent signed and submitted IRS 990 form, as well as a list of your board of directors. For VOCA specific applications, we need to have for the Child Advocacy Center applicants, your letter from Child Advocacy Centers of North Carolina. And then for the human trafficking applicants, we need that letter of support from the Human Trafficking Commission. For VAWA stop applicants, and Karen has highlighted this very well. For culturally specific applicants, we need that specifically, sorry, I get tongue-tied on this every time, culturally specific organization form, and that is available on the website, and it must be signed by your authorizing official and project director. For those applicants that will be providing legal services, there's also a certification form for that, and it must be signed by those same officials. And we need an assurance about polygraph testing and its prohibition. That's also available. For those that are providing law enforcement services, again, we need to see that polygraph testing prohibition. And for the court-ordered batterers intervention programs, as Karen noted, that certification from the North Carolina Council for Women and Youth Involvement. And this year, with the regional batterers intervention programs, a letter from the Council for Women explaining how you are going to be supporting a multi-service area. Okay, finally, completing the application. We've said this over and over and over and over again, and it is very important. They are due at 11:59 p.m. on a Sunday. Staff will not be in the office Saturday the 30th or Sunday the 31st. And so you really should try to have this wrapped up by Friday. I believe that's the 29th. So we have had many a time frantic emails and telephone calls on that last day that applications are due, and we don't want y'all to be in that position because we simply won't be there. Of course, please read that request for applications, as Jim mentioned. Highlight it, put post-its, reminders, whatever you need to do to make sure you are completing the application in its entirety. Also, again, those required attachments, those NCIDs, they're so important, and at any point, you may be locked out of your account. You may need assistance directly from the NCID help desk. Also, start working your narrative sections within a Word document or some sort of word processing document, not in GEMS. That helps you with the word count. It helps you with your spell check, etc. and then using some sort of way to build your budget. We recommend Excel, but you can use what you would like. Making sure your math is adding up. Complete, obviously, all of the required sections of the application, and that includes attachments, and then ensure that your narrative is aligning with your goals, objectives, and budget. Finally, completing the application continued, please avoid using acronyms. It is fine for you to spell out the phrase or terminology that you want to use, and then put it in parentheses, and then use the abbreviations that were in the parentheses throughout the rest of the application. Please be consistent with your staff titles. Use those consistently throughout the application. Be specific in your ask, what you are requesting for this project. Also, that data is so important. Make sure that data applies to the area in which you are providing the services. Again, that required document and documentation and attachments, they need to be submitted with the application. And we are asking you to please label them as instructed. The staff have done a great job explaining that in our request for applications. Also, give yourself that time and don't wait till the last minute. We want you to know that as you complete it as the project director, it then has to go on to the other officials. And if it goes to them and they cannot get in with their NCID, etc., and that can take hours to days sometimes to get the NCID fixed before they can go in and approve it and pass it along electronically in the system. And of course, lastly, we're here to help. Please call us. You have us for 3 months. So please don't wait until that Friday, and certainly don't wait until that Sunday, because we will not be there. All right, and just as a reminder, this is the team, and this is how you can reach us by phone and by email. So now we have time for questions. We are ahead of schedule per the agenda, so we can allow some more time for questions beyond the hour that we had scheduled. But we would like to wrap up and get you all to lunch, which is a very important part of your day. So I will stop sharing and we will start reviewing the questions.
Sandy, so some of the questions have been answered in the chat. If there's anybody that feels that we have, because a lot of questions come through at the same time, if we have not answered your question, you have the opportunity to either unmute yourself and ask the question, or if you could type it again in the chat so it comes down to the as a new question. A trick that we learned is that you can unmute yourself. You can either click unmute, or you can actually hold the space button and use it as a walkie-talkie while you talk and ask your question. So please feel free to start asking questions.
Hi, this is CJ Scarlett. Can you put up the slide with the staff list again and the contact information?
Sure.
Thank you.
Will these slides be available?
Can you see that? Yes, all slides as well as the recording of the webinar will be available on the GCC website. Give us a day or two to get that done, perhaps 3, and you will find them under the workshop information.
I had a question about VAWA funding. We're starting a new lethality assessment project. I think someone might be answering this in chat, but we're starting a new lethality assessment project, and I'm wondering if that's an appropriate VAWA ask.
Yes, lethality assessments are fundable through VAWA.
Great. And that would be for, I mean, our costs are mainly going to be staffing related and training related.
Yep, that is definitely something that's fundable.
Great. And what about court advocacy and accompaniment?
Yep, absolutely. That would be a victim services. Absolutely, that those are fundable.
Okay, thanks.
There's a question in the chat asking under what VOCA priority will previously funded training grants fall?
I can take that question. So Shara, when you're saying previously funded training grants, are you talking about from a statewide organization? We do fund certain agencies out of our administrative funds. However, those are very specific designated agencies. So I'm trying to get some clarification on your question. Okay, she says yes. I forgot what I asked. But I believe that those agencies that will be receiving a portion of administrative training funds will be contacted directly.
Hey, Shara, this is Caroline. We haven't decided and made a decision yet on applications for training grants before. That's going to totally depend on the availability of funding that we have. The last one we did was a 2-year instead of a 1-year. And so I don't anticipate that we'll be doing it this year.
Thanks, Caroline.
And all of the VAWA grants are just 1 year, right?
Correct, up to 1 year for the VAWA stop projects.
Thanks. Are there other VAWA funds other than stop projects available?
The North Carolina Coalition Against Sexual Assault, they also administer the SASP funding that's through VAWA, which is the Sexual Assault Services Program. So they have those VAWA funds for sexual assault services.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
What about domestic violence?
I'm sorry, what was your question?
So, and piggybacking off of that last question, what about domestic violence?
So both VOCA and VAWA support domestic violence, as well as I believe there's tips of funding that supports domestic violence as well.
Hi, this is CJ Scarlett again. Because the agency I'm representing does not have a long history of funding, we're going to need to have another organization to kind of administer the thing. Is it possible that we can use a nonprofit for that, or do we have to use a governmental agency or municipality?
It does not have to be a governmental agency.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And also, I've seen a lot of questions coming up, or I've heard a lot of questions about when are the applications going to be available. So the applications will not be available in GEMS. You will not be able to start this application before November 1st for these priorities.
This was tremendously helpful. Thank you so much.
Good, we're happy to hear that.
You're welcome.
Excuse me, is it possible to request a copy of a previously funded human trafficking application?
Sarah, would this be an application that your agency has submitted?
No, just previously funded to see what kind of projects are out there and what works for human trafficking.
Sarah, I think your best bet there is to work with some of the planners with specifics about what you're looking to do, and they can help give you some guidance.
Thank you.
Are you able to go about how to calculate the indirect if you don't have a pre-negotiated rate?
This is Diane. Can you hear me? So the indirect cost rate information. So when you get into GEMS, even though I went through it briefly how you would do it manually, when you get into GEMS, if you don't have an indirect cost rate, it calculates and you request indirect, then it calculates it using the de minimis, which is going to be 10% of the eligible lines. And what GEMS will ask you to do is what Jim did is you will go through your line item budget and identify the eligible lines based upon the definition of modified total direct cost. So there'll be some tags in there about what's included in MTDC. It kind of like the help when you click on a line, it kind of, you can get little pop-up little balloon windows. Or you can always find the definitions of MTDC online because it's the one used by the federal government, so that you can think about what lines are in your MTDC. And then once you click on those lines and populate your indirect, the computer does it for you.
Hey, Diane, it's Jim. So what you will need to do, there'll be little check marks or little boxes, check boxes to the left of those budget items. So if they qualify based on modified total direct cost, then you would check the box and it will calculate 10% of that line. Now, of course, the planners, we're going to come back and check behind you. And if we see something you have checked that we do not believe should be included, we'll call you about it. We'll discuss it with you and sort of educate you and point you in the direction of what is allowable, what is not allowable, what you can claim indirects on, what you cannot.
And in addition, it's on the internet in general, but I went through that part kind of quick because I was running out of time, but it's also on those slides that were in my pre-award workshop, kind of like what things should be in direct. And so then when you see those line items that says like, this is part of your direct, then those are the ones that you should be clicking the green box beside, clicking the little check box beside so that they become part of your indirect.
Awesome. And one last question. Do you guys have a budget cap number for domestic violence specifically?
That depends on which priority you apply through. So in each application, there are the funding caps are outlined for competitive application. Another thing to note is that you'll see on the front page of the RFAs for VOCA and for VAWA STOP that we have a deadline to submit questions. So last year, prior to COVID, we were actually putting together a frequently asked questions document. So we will be taking the questions asked today, as well as if you have any additional questions that come out, that come up between now and then, we will be able to publish them in that document. So please refer to your RFAs and about the submission of questions after today.
Do you all for general operations?
Not generally. If you're talking about your general HR or your general fiscal staff, we can do a percentage for the budget attributable to this project, or you can utilize the indirect rates. But no, we won't just general fund, for example, an executive director.
Right. The grants fund the direct services. And if there are some other administrative costs that are over and above that for your HR and your fiscal or whatever, then those are part of when you would select an indirect rate. And you would receive funds for that through the indirect rate and be reimbursed for it through the indirect rate.
If you do not have an indirect rate and you're only doing direct costs, then you would need to figure out how much of, for example, the executive director may supervise the crisis line. What percentage of that executive director's time could be attributable, and place the appropriate percentage?
Stay on the call until I got another call I need to make real quick.
Just a reminder to mute yourselves if you're not speaking. Any other questions?
Well, then we really would like to thank you for joining us. Again, we're here for the next several months, starting November 1st. Even as you're pre-planning, we're available now. But please start your application as soon as you can. And we're available by phone and email throughout this process.
And one thing to note is that the document attachments that we're requesting people to use are already available on the GCC website. So if you want to download those, review those, get used to them as they are fillable, you could start doing that as well.
Thank you so much for attending. Have a great afternoon.
Sure.